Okay, please, you can share your possible combination in the chat window. That's how we run this class. So please read the, okay.
Yeah, but that's not what we're not looking for 1 + 2 or +3. We need complete sentences. Similar to what we did for the first example, we need the same thing. We need to write complete sentences, combining these 3 sentences. You can use additional words, you can cut out words, but we want to have shorter sentences. You can do 1 or 2 sentences at the most. No, we're using the chat.
Yeah, please use the chat window. Please don't unmute. Toba, it's harder, but it's possible.
Yeah, we've done this before and had, a lot of conversation in the chat. Also, people can read your sentences as well and share theirs. So when we compare our expectations with experimental results, we identify terminal differing base composition. These terminal are the nearest neighbors of those specifically recognized by the enzymes. Okay, that's a good example. We compare expectations, experimental results, as well as identify any terminal that define base composition. These terminal are the nearest neighbors of those specifically recognized by the enzymes. It seems like no one is changing the third sentence. I'd like to see an example where the third sentence is combined with the others. Maybe using a semicolon, or let's see, this is another example. Expectations compared with experimental results identify any terminal that differ in base composition, and terminal are the nearest neighbor of those specifically recognized by the enzymes. So that person has created 1 sentence. I see more and more examples coming in. Comparing our expectations with experimental results, we identify any terminal that differ in base composition. These terminal are the nearest neighbors of those specifically recognized by the enzymes. That's a very good example using a semicolon. Great. All right, let's move on. So in some cases, we have several sentences that we can combine together and basically lose a lot of words to make our writing clearer. And also, in case you're writing for a journal, they usually have word limits, so you want to remove words that you don't need. In other cases, we might have a long sentence that we want to break up into multiple sentences. And so here's an example. Here we have a sentence. It says, the speaker, though he paid $15,000 to attend the conference, probably felt that the egg on his face was not worth it, and he must still be wondering how a person once all-powerful could have been subjected to such ignominy. So a good place for us to break this sentence is and. So I'd mentioned this before because I'd seen some examples where people were using multiple ands in their sentences. Then we have 2 sentences that still communicate clearly what we're trying to say. So in this case, we're only losing 1 word. In other cases, you might have multiple words that you can remove by splitting your sentence into multiple sentences. So we're gonna have another exercise. Again, please use the chat to share your results. So we want to break the sentence into 2 or more sentences. So the intruder entered through the window and tiptoed down the hall and stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadows. So please break this sentence into 2 sentences or more and share in the chat. So we have a first response. The intruder entered through the window and tiptoed down the hall. He stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadows. That's a good one. Any more examples? We're going to take a few more examples and then we'll move on because we are basically running out of time. All right, the intruder entered through the window and tiptoed down the hall. He or she stood, that's missing the word, stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadows. That's good. It's interesting that most people are assuming that the intruder is a he. It could also be a she. The third, the intruder entered through the window and tiptoed down the hall. He stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadows. So that's similar to the other ones that we've seen. Be nice to see some differences. Entered through the window. So this one, the intruder entered through the window, tiptoed down the hall. He stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadow. So all right. So here are some responses. So the first one breaks the sentence into two sentences. It says the intruder entered through the window. She tiptoed down the hall and stood under the stairwell, waiting in the shadows. The second one, I think it's similar to the one that most people posted. The intruder, who had entered through the window, tiptoed down the hall. He stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadows. So another thing to think about when you're writing sentences is to make your phrases parallel. And this just helps people when they're reading. It makes your sentences flow easier. So an example would be aides in DAR talk about running the country and the manipulation of constitutions. So since we use running in the first part of the sentence, we can use manipulating in the second part of the sentence and get rid of there. And it just makes the sentence run smoothly, and it makes your writing just easier to understand in a sense. So both sentences are correct, however. Here's a sentence that we can try to simplify. So at this point in time, I feel the study needs additional work before the subcommittee can recommend it be submitted for further consideration. How can we simplify this sentence? There's a lot in this sentence that we don't need, that we can just get to the point without saying all the extra stuff. Let's get a couple of examples in the chat. I feel the study needs additional work before it can be recommended and resubmitted for further consideration. That's too long. Can we get another example, shorter, a much shorter example? The study needs additional work before it can be recommended. That's shorter and that's nicer, definitely. Currently, I think the study needs further work before it can be considered further. So you really don't need currently, because you can say the same thing without that word. So here are some very, very short alternatives. The study needs additional work. So that communicates the same thing, which someone just wrote. The study needs more work. So those are two simpler sentences that communicate the exact same thing as what we wrote in the previous page. Another thing to think about when you write is jargon. And jargon is usually words or phrases that you use in a particular field or in a particular community that others might not necessarily understand. So you want to think about, how do you communicate without using jargon? So there are times when you're writing the paper, there's no other way for you to write something. You have to use a word in your field that is not widely known. In other cases, there are ways in which you can communicate without actually using words that only a few people know. So here's a very simple example where someone is saying, I'm having conceptual difficulty with these employee mandates. And they don't really need to say all of that. They can just say, I don't understand this work rules. So even though this sentence communicates the same thing, it's a little bit more complex. And you can say the same thing for everyone to understand by just saying, I don't understand this work rules. So let's go into paragraphs. Because these are the most important part of our paper. If you want to build a paper, you need to write good paragraphs. So once you've written your sentences, you want to bring your sentences together and create a paragraph. And your paragraph should communicate a particular idea, and it should be presented in a way that's easy for people to follow. So parts of a paragraph include the topic sentence. So this tells your readers what the paragraph is about. It doesn't have to be the first sentence, but it has to work. And what I mean in this case is that if you decide to make it a second sentence, it should flow from the first sentence. It should be something that someone reads the first sentence, reads the second sentence, and they see that it makes sense. Then you have the main body of your paragraph. That is where you put all the extra information for your readers to better understand the topic of the paragraph. And then you have your closing. So your closing comes after the body of the paragraph, and it may summarize the paragraph, remind your readers of the topic, or link the paragraph to the next one. And it can do all three. It's always important for your paragraphs to connect to each other. And you can do that by using phrases. You can do that by using words. You can do that by building on the same idea, so that when someone is reading, they go from one paragraph to the other and they see that as a flow. So here are some examples of sentences that connect. So in this paragraph, we're talking about sectors. As you can see, the word sectors keep being repeated. So in less than 50 years since we first talked in the United States of the two sectors of a modern society, the public sector, the government, and the private sector, business. In the past 20 years, the United States has begun to talk of a third subdivision, the nonprofit sector, those organizations that increasingly take care of the social challenges of the modern society. So the word sector repeats multiple times. So when you're reading these, you'll constantly be reminded that the paragraph is about sector. Here's another example. This one comes from a paper that I published. It says, despite these associations between obesity and the built environment, so the paper was about obesity, inconsistencies have been noted across studies and geographic contexts on the association between specific features of the built environment and obesity prevalence. These inconsistencies, so I go from the first sentence to the second sentence, and there's a connection there. So in the first sentence, I'm talking about the presence of inconsistencies, and then now I'm saying these inconsistencies could be due to variations in measures and measurement tools across studies, making it difficult to assess and compare findings. Furthermore is another way that I'm using to connect these two sentences. I'm saying, in addition to what I've already talked about, here's more information. So if you look at this paragraph, the certain words that keep repeating themselves. So things like measures and measuring. And then you have inconsistency, that's also repeated. And then you have furthermore, that's also used to connect things. So these are different ways in which you can connect an idea in a sentence so that it's easy for someone to follow. So your sentences should not be things that stand by themselves without any connection. There must be a connection between your sentences. Another example from another paper that we wrote. In this case, if we just look at this paragraph, I'm going to give you a minute to read it. You see that digital platforms is what we're trying to talk about here. Okay, I hope people got a chance to read through that. Here are more examples. So the slides are going to be shared and you're going to see this. So this particular example is showing how I connect the first paragraph to the second one. So the second paragraph is much longer than the single sentence that's included here. But the first paragraph ends with a discussion or a mention of the complex challenges that come with using digital platforms for public health surveillance in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the second paragraph starts with these challenges. So to address these challenges, so for you to understand what the first sentence is in the second paragraph is talking about, you have to go back to the previous paragraph. So there's that link where I'm building on the ideas that were presented in the previous paragraph. So use transition words and phrases to connect sentences and paragraphs. So transition words are things like furthermore, in addition to, also. So these are things that can easily allow you to connect your sentences and also paragraphs. I encourage people to use the active voice when they write, because I think it's just more, it's active. It's a lot more exciting than the passive voice. But in some cases, people are usually encouraged to use the passive voice. So you want to think about where are you in terms of your field, and then use the appropriate voice when writing. So the active voice, so just to give an example, the active voice in this case would say the research officer designed the experiment. And the passive voice would say the experiment was designed by the research officer. Personal or impersonal, those are also things that are important to think about. So I would usually write using a personal voice or personal point of view. So I believe that the explanation for this phenomenon may be found in, while someone else might say the explanation for this phenomenon may be found in. So they don't really present a personal view. And sometimes you can use both. So when you're writing, sometimes there's a need for you to say what you personally are thinking. And in other cases, you can just say, if it's an idea that is well known, you can just present it as it is. That you have to think about. Past versus present tense is, in most cases, you would use both for different sections of the paper. So maybe when you're writing about your introduction, you might use the present tense to state what your goals are and what you want to do. But then if you're reviewing papers that have been written in the past, you might want to use the past tense. So when you arrange details in a paragraph, you want to do it in a way that allows people to understand what you're presenting. So usually scientific writing requires deductive reasoning. And what this means is that organization of the material goes from general to specific. And it makes complex concepts easy to understand. So here's an example where we start with giving you global numbers. So the global burden of disease study estimates that more than 603 million adults worldwide were obese in 2015. So we're stating the problem at the global level. And then now we go to the US level, because the paper is about the US. And then we say in the United States, more than 1/3 of the adult population is obese. And then we go down to the state level, and 46 states have an estimated adult obesity rate of 25% or more. So the paper that we wrote was actually at the city level. So we're going down and down and being more specific. This is a good way to organize information, because you're giving a general view and then helping the individual better understand why is this, especially when you're defining your problem, why is this problem important? What does it look like? Let's say you're writing a paper that focuses on a city in Nigeria, you can say, here's a national problem, here's the problem at the state level, here's a problem at the city level. That's one way that you can present information to help people understand it better. In the method section, you want to organize your information in a chronological order, because you're presenting a process. You're saying, I did A, and then I did B, and then I did C, and then I did D. And then that would help. If someone wants to reproduce your work, then they can follow the steps that you present in your methods to do the same thing that you've done. Here's a very simple example. In this case, we basically use first, second, third. And I think this is very helpful. You don't always have to use this approach, but this is one approach that you can use to state exactly what you've done. So first, we constructed a keyword list. Second, we focused on personal reports. Third, we did blah, 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 blah. So this is an easy way for you to communicate so that someone can follow this. Someone can follow exactly what you did. You can post your questions right here on the chat. So just to review what we've gone over, good scientific writing is clear. You want to avoid unnecessary detail. It's simple. You want to use direct language. So don't use jargon if you don't need to use jargon. It should be impartial. So don't make sentence or avoid making sentence that are very, that are filled with assumptions. So everyone knows, for example, or it can never be proven. That's another example. You want to structure your writing logically, so present ideas and processes in a way that is logical, in a way that people can follow, especially when you're writing about your methods so that it's easy for people to reproduce. It's accurate, so it avoids vague and ambiguous language. If you have estimated something, say this is the estimate. Avoid using things like approximately unless it's absolutely necessary. It's objective, so statements and ideas are supported by appropriate evidence. So you've done work, you've done research, and you have that results to back up whatever statements you're making, or other people have done work. And so you have a way of backing up whatever statements you're making. So we're going to take questions. Go ahead and put your questions in the chat while I open another set of slides.
Okay, Ellen, we have some questions.
Yes. I'm trying to load my slides, so I will get to that. Perfect. Great. Wow, this is a long one. Okay, this person has chosen AI as a field of research, and they've learned that one has to read broadly on the area of research to get to know what has been done so far in the area. I started by reading difficult journals, some of which I find to be feasible to do, but had the problem of sourcing data, and others which seems to require deep research on that particular area, e.g. the area of medicine, which I felt interested into. I tend to go for the ones that look feasible. Taking one of the journals, I once felt like working on its future work titled Trees versus Neurons. Okay. I'm not saying if I'm doing it the right way. I felt like working on suggested future work with. I think it's definitely one way of doing it. I'm looking at what other people have done and then looking at the future work section of the paper, or the limitation section of the paper can give you ideas of what to work on. So that's definitely a good approach. I know many people would do that. And also, when you start reading research papers, sometimes it's really hard to understand, and you might need more time to understand what the different words used in the or different terminology in the particular field are. Once you understood that, then you can go back and read the same paper and you might get a better understanding the second or third time. How can one avoid personalizing a write-up? I'm not exactly sure I understand what that means. So a lot of my papers that I write, I would say we did XYZ, we did this analysis, we found this result. So in a sense, it's personalizing for me. So I'm not sure why you want to avoid that, unless if it's a requirement that you don't talk about that, then you mostly would use the passive voice in that case. Instead of saying we did this experiments, you say the experiments were done. Can we talk about writing references? Again, what do you mean by writing references? How can a new researcher figure out what to work on? That's a very good question. And I think it relates to the first question, which has to deal with reading. So you want to read what other people have done in your field. So if you have a particular topic that you're interested in, read papers in that space. Initially, it will be hard for you to understand, but once you've figured out what the terminology means, then you can go back and read the same papers and you find that you understand them better. Always look at the future research section to see what ideas have been presented and see if those are ideas that you can pursue for your own research. Attending talks is another way too. So if there are talks that are being presented either at your university or some of these meet groups, look into those and listen to what other people are doing, learn from them, and that would help you think about what are some of the problems even in your own community that you can try to solve. Okay, so it says that the current session ends in 1 hour. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. I thought it was 30 minutes. So we'll talk a little bit about references. And then the other question is, how do we deal with research which sourcing data locally seems not easy or not possible? I think that's a challenge for many people. I tend to try to think about what alternative data sources are available depending on the question. So let's say you want to work on a question that requires you to collect survey data and there's not survey data, can you get some of that data from social media sites, or can you get it from Google searches, for example? So Twitter, for example, has an open API where you can get 1 to 2% of all publicly available tweets, and that can be a lot of data depending on what question you want to answer. Another way would be to build collaborations with people who have access to data. So if there are research institutes that have access to data, you could contact them and see if it's possible to collaborate with them. And if you see papers that people have written that have used the kind of data that you're interested in, you can contact the authors of those papers and ask them if they're interested, if they can share the data, or if they're interested in collaborating with you, so that whatever you write, they would be included as co-authors on that paper, because they provide the data and they can also give you input into what kinds of analysis you can do that they haven't yet done with the data. I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm trying to get a master's in data science and I am from a non-quantitative background. Is that possible? What do I have to do? It's definitely possible for you to get a master's in data science, even if you're from a non-quantitative background. It might require a lot more learning, a lot more effort if you've not been trained to think quantitatively, but it's definitely feasible to do. It might be if you have, let's say you already had, I don't know what your degree is, your background is in. So let's say you focus on biology, you can still do a master's and focus your research project on a biological problem. So in a sense that could give you even more motivation because you already have a background in biology and you can use that to propel yourself to learn more about quantitative aspects of research that can be applied in biology. How can we have access to research grants? Oh, that's a big question. Research grants, depending on who's offering the grants, usually have different expectations and different things, different qualifications that they expect the applicants to have. So you want to search broadly. I think there's a lot more attention now to offering research grants to data science researchers in African countries. And so I think the opportunities are opening up. So keep your eyes open, especially for organizations that work in the space, including things like Deep Learning in Daba, Data Science Africa. They've all been offering grants recently to solve specific problems or to just solve problems in your community. So look at those organizations and those spaces and see what comes up. And then when you apply, try to make sure that you have a group that is strong enough. So you want to include collaborators who have expertise in the area that you're applying for. So if you want to do health research, don't just put together a group of computer scientists who don't really know anything about health. Bring in a health researcher, a public health researcher who can guide you through that process. It will make your grant a lot stronger. What reputable journals would you recommend for AI researchers to try publishing in? I think there's so many journals out there that you can publish in. It depends on your focus. So for me, when I do AI related work, I publish in public health journals because my focus is public health. So if your focus is on a different subject area, you want to look at what journals are available in your field and also see what other researchers who are working in machine learning and AI, where they publish so that you can publish in similar spaces. Any other questions? All right, so we're gonna go back to the slides and we'll take more questions as we go. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will pause and answer them from time to time. So we've talked about constructing sentences, paragraphs, and how all of those will come together to create paper. So now let's talk about writing the paper itself. So as I mentioned before, different fields will have differences in how they talk, basically, so the jargon that is used in the field. And they'll also have differences in how and critical thinking is extremely important and is defined as the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a found this result. It's okay for you to question whether that result makes sense. And not just for questioning's sake, but you want to look at the evidence. What is the evidence that's being presented, and is it strong enough to back up the statements that have been made? So here are some questions that you can think about when you read at the assumptions. What assumptions did they make in the paper?
I can hear you very well.
Okay. So that might be that person's computer. Okay, thank you. Thank you, guys. So another question you want to ask is the data representative? So does it include a representation of the population? Who is included? Who is excluded? are the results generalizable? So if it's not representative, should we take the conclusions that the paper is making at Is there another way of approaching this question or problem? So say that tool about who gets to go What are other questions that you could ask while reading a research paper? What are other things that you might want to know when you're reading a research paper? Feel free to drop your answers in the chat.
Okay, please, if you have other questions that you think we can ask, please put it in the chat window. Okay.
How relevant is it to the local community? Great answer. Oh, great question. Any other questions?
You know, I was thinking that people presented posters. What are the questions that you asked
What
when
you read?
Yeah, in the morning. I was thinking people will have more answers to this. What are the other questions that you asked that is not listed here? Let the team learn from you. Okay.
Yes, my proposed method's been adopted before. Yes, that's definitely a good question. So if you're presenting a solution that you think is new, you want to look at other people's papers to see if they've already presented that solution. And it doesn't mean that you cannot present the same solution, but your solution has to improve what you've done. It shouldn't just replicate the same thing. So when you do your literature review, you want to define your topic clearly, because that will help you to find the papers that you need to review. So an example would be road accidents in Sierra Leone. That's a very specific topic. You also want to use multiple platforms to find information. You can use PubMed, Google Scholar, Scientific African journals online. There's several different platforms depending on what you're interested in looking for. You also want to search and research. So sometimes you do your initial literature review, and if it's in a space where people are constantly publishing in, and also when you write your paper, it's important for you to state when your search happened. So you can say, I conducted my search from August 1st to August 3rd, so that the journal and the reviewers know that if something else happened after that, it was not captured in your search. Take notes while reading, and this is very important, especially when you're reading many papers. If you make notes, then you can just read your notes and review what you've done. You don't have to go back and reread the same paper over and over again. So making good notes is always important. You want to keep your review focused, and this goes back to the initial point of defining your topic clearly. So instead of having a topic that is too broad and covers too many things, you want to make sure that it's focused. And sometimes you have to refine your topic. So you might have a topic and then you go to Google and you put in the search for Google Scholar, and you see that there are 100,000 papers that have been written in recent years. And that might be an indication that your topic is too broad. Think about, how do I revise my topic so that it's more focused and can give me the information that I need. Be critical and consistent. So this is where critical thinking comes in. So read your papers, other people's papers, question them, and then find where limitations exist. Sometimes you might not find any limitations in the paper, but for most studies that have been done, there are usually limitations in assumptions, in conclusions that you can highlight and also build your work upon. So let's go into the different parts of a paper. The first part is writing the introduction. So the introduction and reading other papers, you want them to read your paper. So make sure that your introduction provides them with enough detail for them to read your paper and understand it. The introduction should also provide a rationale for the present study. So why are you conducting this study? Why is it important? What does it contribute to the field? So some simple rules to think about when you're working on your introduction. Make sure that the problem that you're trying to solve is clearly stated. Review pertinent literature to orient your reader, so do a very thorough literature review. State the major contribution of the paper and how it differs from previous studies. So your paper might be very similar to something else that has already been done, but there might also be some differences, and you want to highlight what those differences are. Some journals might ask you to state your major results in the introduction, or some conferences might ask you to do that as well, but others might not. So look at the guidelines and follow them. So let's just go through one example. I like to use the work that I have done because it's easier for me to explain it. So this is a paper that we wrote a few years ago where we're using deep learning to examine the association of the built environment, that's the environment around you, and the prevalence of obesity in US cities. So here's what our introduction looks like. I'm going to give you a minute or a couple minutes to read through. And if you have questions or observations that you make, feel free to put them in the chat. So this paragraph is mostly a review of or stating what the bigger problem is. So we start off, as I mentioned before, stating the problem globally, and then we state the problem in the US, and then we talk about the factors that have contributed to this specific problem. So here's the second paragraph of our introduction. This one is more of a literature review. So the square brackets here are references. So here we have reference 826. So we had to read many papers for a literature review to include in this paragraph. And as you can see, we summarized most of the papers to include them basically in a few sentences, right? So several of the papers had a similar idea. They did the research differently, they used different data sets, but the idea was similar. So it was easy for us to pull out the major ideas from those papers and include it in just a few sentences. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph. So the last paragraph is where we state what we state the specific problem that we're trying to address in this paper. So we started off with stating what the problem is globally and what the problem is in the US, factors contributing to those problems. The second paragraph, we go into the literature review, which builds up on the initial paragraph by giving more evidence of what the factors are based on what other people have done. And then in this last paragraph, we're saying that despite the work that other people have done, there are still limitations. And here's how we want to address those limitations. Please put questions in the chat if this is not clear. So I also want to highlight the word despite in this case, because it's basically saying, okay, now we're moving in a different direction. So we've talked about all these wonderful things that people have done, but despite all these wonderful things, there are limitations, and we are going to try to address some of those limitations. Okay, moving on. So this is the last paragraph of the introduction. And yeah, we're saying that, yes, what we're proposing specifically, yes, how we're going to solve that problem. I want to highlight in this paragraph that there was another work that had been published by some of my colleagues right before we submitted our paper for review. And they had done something similar to what we had done, but they had used Google Street Images instead of satellite images. And so that was a difference. There was also a difference in their methods, but the overall idea was very similar. So instead of just pretending like this paper doesn't exist, we had to acknowledge that the paper existed and then state why our paper is still relevant and how our paper is different from their paper. And this happens. So the ideas you have are not always going to be unique. So sometimes you might be working on a project and you find that someone is working on the same idea. The goal at that point is to, if this is someone you can work with, you can join forces and write one paper. But if this is someone that you don't know, or maybe you really need to work on your project for a dissertation or something like that, you want to think about ways in which your approach is different from their approach. What do you bring to the table that is unique? I hope this makes sense to people. Okay, any questions about the introduction? Please put your questions in the chat. okay, please can a research for a different location be done in a different location? Does that make it novel? Yes. Again, it depends on what the differences in the locations. So if you have a research study that was done in one country and you want to do in another country, then definitely that is new because it's not been done in that country and it contributes new knowledge. So let's talk about writing the materials and methods if we don't have any questions in the introduction. So another question, why is your title general? I mean, not stating the actual deep learning approach used in the work. Is that okay? It was okay in this particular case because the audience we were writing for do not really, most of the people are either medical doctors or public health practitioners who do not necessarily know or use AI techniques on a day-to-day basis. And so stating the specific technique would not have provided them with any new knowledge or new information. So in this case, using the general term, which some people might be familiar in, worked better. But in other cases, depending on your audience, you might need to use the specific deep learning approach that you used. So writing the materials and methods is our next section. So again, this would differ from different fields, but the goal is the same. When you write your materials and methods, the purpose is to provide enough detail that a competent person in your field, a competent researcher, can repeat the experiments. So at the end of the day, we want our work to be reproducible. So here are some things that you should think about when you're writing your materials section. If you do write a materials section, you want to include exact technical details. So if you've measured things, include the measurements, the units. You want to identify organisms. If you use organisms in your study, most of you are probably not doing that kind of work. If you've used human subjects data, which is what most of us do, you want to describe what the data is, what is included in the data. And if you have a process of getting these reviewed, so in some institutions, they have an institutional review board. If you have one of those, you want to submit your proposal to them so that they can review it and approve it. And the reason for this is so that your research does not cause harm to the populations that you're studying. So you want your study to help people, but not to make people's lives worse. When you write the methods, we've talked a bit about this, you want to present it in a chronological order. So you want people to be able to follow. So we did 1, we did 2, we did 3, we did 4, and so forth. Use subheadings that helps people to understand what different sections are. So if you have a very long method sections, when you use subheadings, and people know you're going from one type of analysis, or you're going now from describing the data to describing an analysis section. Be precise, always important. State your exact measurements, exact temperature if you're using temperature, for example. State your method of investigation and reason for selecting that method if necessary. So if you're using a method that is widely known in your field, you might not need to justify it as much, but if you're using something that is new that people don't normally use, then you definitely want to justify why you're using that approach. Do not overstate ordinary statistical methods. What I mean here is if you're using statistical tests that have always add references and additional details if you're using new methods or if you're using advanced methods. And in general, I think it's just a general rule. If you're using something that someone else has introduced, just add a reference to it. It doesn't do any harm to your work. So let's do another example. So for this paper, we looked at online reports of foodborne illness. And we wanted to see whether what people were posting on the internet was similar to what the Centers for Disease Control in the US was capturing in terms of what was making people sick. So in our methods, we started with the data sources. In most of my papers, this is the process that I use. I always start by describing the data in my methods. So what is the data source? How many years of data do we have? If we have an exact number on data points, how many data points do we have? All of that gets introduced in the methods. And then the next section, as you can see, I'm using subheadings to help guide the reader through. So the next section, we have analysis, but then even within that, we have subsections for analysis. So the first subsection is keyword matching. So we took a list of terms that we had for foodborne illnesses, things like diarrhea, vomiting, puking, and then we tried to extract the postings from the internet that contained these terms. So that was what we meant by keyword matching. And so we had a paragraph that described what we did. And then the next subsection is our classification criteria. This is where we go through our reports and make sure that they're actually relevant for what we're trying to do. Again, I just want to highlight the subsections and how each subsection is dealing with a specific topic. And this just makes it easier for people to read and follow. Another thing to note is that the reference style is different. So different journals have different reference styles. So in the other example I showed you, we use square brackets and we had numbers. Here we actually have author last name and year included. So you want to look at the reference style for either the journal or the conference to make sure that you're using the correct reference style when you write a paper to be published. Here's another example, but it's basically the same idea. So in this case, we're also looking at unsafe food products and using Amazon reviews to detect unsafe food products. The methods again starts with the data gathering. So what does our data set look like? In this case, we had two different data sets and we had to describe both data sets and then describe what years of data we have. Sometimes you might just have a few weeks of data, that's okay. You can describe exactly what those weeks are. This is a bit longer because the data gathering itself was an aim in the paper. So something that we did to help the reader understand exactly what we're trying to do, we use things like our first project aim. So stating that clearly is very useful. It guides the reader to what you're trying to accomplish, and then they can, as a reviewer, for example, they can look at what your aims are, see what your results are, and then see whether you actually accomplish the aims that you stated that you were trying to do. And then we have data processing and analysis as a subsection within the methods. And then our second aim comes in there. And we also state that very clearly. Our second project aim was to do this. You don't always have to write this way, but think about when you're writing, think about the reader. Think about what is the best way that someone reading this paper can find the information that they need to find easily. And then we go into our machine learning approaches. So again, the subheading for this section is identifying reports on safe food products. So we've stated what our aims are and how we plan to accomplish them. And then we go into how we implemented all these different methods to accomplish our second aim. So that's the methods. Any questions on writing the method section? Please put it in the chat.
Wow. Okay, please, do you have questions? Let's put them in the chat window.
Today we have a very quiet group.
Yes, it's interesting, but let's just assume they are soaking it all in, because one of the most popular questions that we get is about how do I know what to research about, and you know you've done justice to that, and we hope people do more interesting work. Okay, Olaraju says, "Oh no, you are explaining really well."
That's good. That's good to know. All right. If there are no questions, we can go on to the results. Let's make the most of the time that we have. So when you write your results, you want to state your findings clearly. Again, the goal is always to get the reader to understand. So do not state methods in your results section. This can differ for different fields and different journals. So there are some fields or some journals that would allow you to describe your results and describe your methods in the same section. But in my field, usually your method section is separate from your results section. Your results section is usually just everything that you've observed after you applied the methods. You also want to choose what you present. If you conducted 100 experiments, it doesn't mean that you have to create a table with 100 rows of results. Think about how to summarize your results. Can you use your mean? Can you use a median? Can you use a standard deviation to present your result? So think about what is the best way to present your results? Or maybe you're doing things that are separate and you want to think of what is the best out of the 100 that I can present, or what are the 3 best that I can present in the paper. So some simple rules to think about when you're writing your results: look at your journal guidelines. Journals tend to give you guidelines about how to present your results so that it's in line with the other papers that they've published in the journal. Do not repeat information in tables or figures in the text. And what I mean by this is, if you've taken the time to construct a beautiful figure explaining your results, you don't need to write all of that again in your text because you're just repeating yourself. You can refer back to the figure or to the table and say, for additional information, see figure 1 or table 1. Your results should be short and sweet, which basically means they should be precise. You don't need to write extra sentences that don't need to be there. So if you've done experiment, 100 experiments, we did 100 experiments, here are the findings that we made. You can use statistics to create summaries, as I mentioned. And always remember that your whole paper stands or falls on the basis of your results. So if your results are not strong enough, then your paper is not going to be strong enough. Or if they're not presented, you can do amazing work, but if you don't present it in a way that is clear for someone to understand, then your paper will fall based on that. So let's do one example. For this study, we developed an approach for monitoring influenza epidemics in China using searches. So what were people searching for on Baidu, which is basically the Google of China? So I'll give you a minute to look at the results, because I think it's very important to think about how to write your results. Another thing I want to mention is that some conferences or journals will allow you to combine your results in your discussion. So your results might end up being much longer than what I'm presenting here. So in this case, we have our results separate from our discussion. So some things that I want to highlight is the reference to table 2. So if you go to table 2, you would see that we had a lot more information than what we're presenting in the text. So in the text, we only highlight what is important. We also mentioned table 3. So there's an additional information in table 3, and then figure 1 also, which gives you more information. So if you've summarized your results in tables or figures, you don't need to write everything in the text. Just highlight what is most important and then refer to your table and your figures. The second and third paragraphs, again, just build on what we wrote in the initial paragraph. by giving specific information that we thought would be interesting to the reader and to the journal reviewers as well. So the last, I think this is the last section. I think maybe I talk about the abstract later, but the discussion is usually in my field separated from the results, but as I mentioned, some fields will have them together. And in your discussion, you want to basically put what you've observed within what other people have done, right? And it can be the hardest to write because the guidelines are not always clear. Sometimes you end up with discussions that are too long. But in most cases, I think the main thing that you want to do is present a summary of your findings and then discuss why are your findings important, discuss what are the limitations, if there are any limitations in the work you've done, and then future direction. So if you've done work, don't be shy, discuss the significance of your work. As I've mentioned, discuss your findings, point out exceptions in your findings. So if you're finding things that are, so in this case, instead of do not reiterate the results, it was not do not restate the results. So if you've already written your results section, you just want to summarize what the results are. You don't have to write everything that you've written in the results section already. And if you find things that other people have not found in their research, highlight those. Say these are the exceptions to my findings, and this is why they're important. That also leads to point number 4. So if your results agree or disagree with previous findings, you want to show that. If they disagree, state why they disagree. Clearly state your conclusions and provide evidence to support that. Don't state conclusions that are not supported by your findings. Your conclusions have to be supported by your findings. So here's another example, again, looking at influenza, but this time in the US. So these are our discussion. So our results were much shorter, where we're just saying, we did this analysis, we found X, we found, Y. And then now we come to our discussion and we're saying, yes, why our findings are significant? Yes, what they demonstrate. In this case, we're comparing it to what other people have done. Google had a flu tool, a tool that was supposed to be predicting influenza in the US. And we were saying that what we have done is better than what the Google tool is currently producing. And that's one way to do it, especially if you're building on work that has already been done previously. So if other people have done similar research and you're doing new research, state why your findings are better or how they improve on the field. The next paragraph, so the first paragraph is saying this is important. The second paragraph builds again on that and then starts making suggestions about what we can do in the future. So our findings, for example, can be combined with other types of data to improve how we predict influenza outbreaks. And then we have a whole limitation section. Not every field has this, but it's important for you to think about it as a researcher because your limitation could inspire you to do new research. So if you've written a paper and you find out, okay, there are all these things that I could have done better, maybe in your next study, you would think about those limitations and build new methods. If methods don't already exist to address those limitations, you can build new methods to address those limitations. And then finally, after our limitations, we have our conclusions. So your limitations do not mean that your paper is terrible. It's just saying that I've done research, it's not perfect, like most of scientific research. Here are the limitations, but then in your conclusions, you want to say, despite the fact that these limitations exist, this study is still important. secondary in terms of my results. So your abstract should describe your main objective of your study, explain why the study was done, why is it important, briefly state the methods without including too much. Your abstract should cover. Some journals will allow citations in abstract, and most do not. When you also write your abstract, avoid abbreviations, because not everyone is going to understand what the abbreviations mean. Especially if you use it, you can write the complete phrase and then put your abbreviation in brackets. If you have questions, feel free. If you have additional questions beyond the session, feel free to email rathel@gmail.com. And if you have a manuscript that you need feedback on, also feel free to send that. If you have questions, put them in the chat and we would discuss in the time that we have left. So there's one question: for a research that involved a lot of math, should the paper contain all the rigorous math or just the findings? So that depends on your audience. Math that you used. But if you're writing for an applied audience, an applied journal, then you want to focus on your findings. You can include references to additional information. So if people want to learn more about the methods, they can go find it in another source. You don't need to include all of the math.
Okay, so I can see a question about the slides. Like we've said throughout this bootcamp, for every registered participant in this bootcamp, you will have access even to the sessions you could not attend. You know, we are aware that 2 other sessions are going on, so we have thought of that. You will have access to the learning content as long as you're registered and, you know, part of this bootcamp. Okay, Dr. Ellen, okay, we have more questions.
Yes. Are the limitations and conclusions included under the discussion? Yes. In this paper, we include this under this discussion. If you have an idea that could lead you to a potential usable product, would you advise the person to start writing first or build a product to see if it works before writing? I would say start writing first. I always advise you to start writing. Can someone with life science degree like microbiology apply for postgraduate studies in AI, ML, or DS? I think you can apply, definitely, but you would have to show for most programs that you've done some kind of quantitative work. So if you've taken some courses in AI or machine learning, then you should definitely mention those in your application. Any other? Like on Coursera, yes. You can definitely mention Coursera courses, especially if they've been graded. If you have a certification, you need something to show that you actually did the work. A way that the graduate program can evaluate you. And some programs also might have quantitative exams that you have to take prior to entrance. So that could also help with your application to show that you do have a quantitative background beyond your life sciences. Other questions? Can I write a paper as an undergrad? Yes, yes, yes. I encourage undergrads to write papers. If you have opportunity to do research as an undergrad, please do it. It would definitely help you if you decide to go to graduate school, it would help your graduate school application. To all the people posting things. And do feel free to use the resources that Red There offers. We're always happy to help. Will you advise PhD by publication or by thesis? So it depends on the university. My dissertation was by publication. Some other universities do it by thesis. Can I write papers alone? I mean, must you have collaborators? Yes, you can write papers alone. There are fields where people actually do that a lot. But I think for most data science papers I see, because it's a very interdisciplinary field, you usually want to have other people with different opinions on your papers because it will help your paper be better. But yes, you can write papers alone. I have written commentaries which do not involve any analysis alone. So that's one way of writing papers alone. But when it comes to method papers, I always include other people because people have different ways of thinking about things that are different from how I think about things. Can you throw more light on what PhD by publications really entails? So PhD by publications, in my case, I did publish those papers after I graduated. So I published every single one of them after I graduated. But before I graduated, I only published one. So that's basically what it meant at my university. Some other universities might actually expect you to either have submitted the papers or the papers have to be accepted or under review for you to graduate.
Okay, Tim, more questions? If you have more questions, please ask in the chat window. Okay. Dr. Elaine, if we don't have other questions, we can bring this to an end. Everyone can join the main page from the breakout room.
Wonderful.
Hello, Dr. Elaine. Do you have more things to share, like conclusion or bye-bye? Okay, in the absence of other questions, kindly click on leave room and join you can leave the breakout room. Yes, and I hope that people do more with all the great things Dr. Elaine teaches. She takes her time, she answers the most important questions. She's she's been a great teacher to the community. So we hope that you do interesting things. It's our desire at Data Science Nigeria that all the things that you learn, bringing people from all over the world, the best in the world at what they do, that you can do interesting things with what you learn. So, of course, we are grateful to have Dr. Elaine.
And if you do publish papers, please send them to me. I'm always happy to see that people are writing papers.
Okay, you saw our contact. She's on Twitter. You have her email address. Definitely, we expect you to, handle our contact with honor. But she's always open. Yes, please don't. But share your papers, share your idea, be clear, and understand that she's busy. So, just handle that with honor. That's all I can say. Okay, so kindly join the main room. If you click on leave room, it will give an option to join the meeting, to join the main org before our control room. So you can just click on leave breakout room. It takes you back to the main event.